to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Philip Obaji Jr. He's a Nigeria-based reporter who is with us to tell a harrowing tale of abuses and mistreatment he personally was subjected to, and many other people at the hands of Russia-linked groups in the Central African Republic. And we'll talk about the human rights violations that became even more prominent in some of the African countries after Russia's involvement in local politics. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today. And let's start with talking a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got involved in this area of media.
Thank you, Irina. It's such a pleasure to join you. Well, for the past 4 years or thereabout, I have been covering Russian activities in West and Central Africa. As some people may know, Russian paramilitaries are very active in the Central African Republic, in Mali, where you have over 1,000, Russian so-called military instructors in the country. That's talking about Mali. While the Russians have been present in Mozambique, also in Sudan, and also in Libya. But my interest in the activities of the Russian Wagner Group began sometime in 2018, the same year when 3 Russian journalists who had traveled from Moscow to the Central African Republic to investigate the activities of the Wagner Group were killed. They were shot dead by, gunmen who no one knows exactly what they are right now for sure. So when that incident happened in 2018, my editor at the Daily Beast at the time, Christopher Dickey, asked me to look into what happened before the death of this journalist. And I began to make phone calls. I was living in Nigeria, and I began to make phone calls to some of my contacts in the Central African Republic. I spoke to people in the armed forces, some people I knew very closely. I spoke to some friends who lived in the area where the Russians were killed, the Russian journalists were killed. And I found something very interesting, that the area at which they were killed wasn't too much of a volatile area. So, which meant at the time that the people who killed this journalist probably did so because they didn't want this journalist to, dig anything or to find out more about what was going on in the country as far as Russian operations was concerned. So ever since then, I began to focus a lot on what was going on in the Central African Republic as far as the operations of Russian paramilitaries was concerned. So that was what actually developed my interest in investigating the Wagner Group, in looking into what the Wagner Group was doing in the Central African Republic. It was the death of these 3 Russian journalists that kickstarted my coverage of the Central African Republic.
I remember that particular incident made some splash in the Western media, but the ultimate outcome of the investigation and what happened, if anything, that I don't think it was it got a lot of coverage. What happened once you started investigating it, and where did it lead you?
Well, I wanted to find out exactly what happened before their death, where the journalists were, when did they enter the Central African Republic, what was their mission, how did they die, why did they die? So I had to ask many questions, spoke to people who know the country very well, who know the area the journalists were killed very well. And unfortunately, the government was not willing to cooperate in terms of speaking about what happened. Mm-hmm. And even the investigation that the government themselves said they were going to carry out to ascertain the real, what really happened before their death and who may be responsible. We never heard anything again afterwards. We didn't see any reports by the government telling us exactly what their investigation concluded. So from the government angle, there was nothing to tell us exactly what happened in Sibut. Sibut was the town where they were killed. And from my point of view, I only was able to establish that this area that the killing took place wasn't so much of a dangerous area, before the incident occurred. And my conclusion was that the killing of this journalist probably was intentional in the sense that it was well planned. It wasn't just killing that occurred out of maybe robbers trying to rob people or or something in that nature, So it looked to me at the time as if the killing of the journalist was well planned and well orchestrated.
So what happened after that story? What else did you continue to investigate?
So yes, I started to look at the activities of the Wagner group. And before these three journalists were killed, we didn't know a lot about this group. We only knew that the Russians were present in the country and they were going to train local soldiers in the Central African Republic. But the death of the journalists actually, brought a lot of interest as to what really these people were doing. And much later, I began to get phone calls from some local journalists in the Central African Republic telling me about what they've noticed in terms of the actions and behavior of these Russian paramilitaries. And I started to hear, from a lot of locals, stories about human rights abuses and what have you. So I began to dig deeply into the operations of this group. And when I realized initially that the Wagner group was a group sponsored by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch who, until his death, was somewhat of a close friend to President Vladimir Putin. So once I learned that he was, the financier of this group and also the founder, it was interesting because at the time when Wagner became present in the Central African Republic, Yevgeny Prigozhin had already been named or maybe indicted by the American government for being involved in the 2016 US election interference. The Internet Research Agency, which he founded in St. Petersburg in Russia, was actually blamed or accused of being behind, a troll operation that targeted the American elections. So that was interesting to me, and I wanted to find out more about what this group he founded, the Wagner group in the Central African Republic, were actually up to. So I started to hear testimonies from locals who said they were either abused, tortured, raped, or maltreated by these Russian soldiers. And I also began to find out about trolls, internet trolls in the Central African Republic that were, put together by the Wagner group just to spread disinformation targeting France in particular. So that was how my involvement in investigating the Wagner group began to grow, began to expand, looking at disinformation, looking at human rights atrocities, and all sorts of ill behavior by Wagner mercenaries. Yeah.
So my basic understanding of Wagner's group in CAR was that they were interested in gaining access to mines in exchange for the security training to the government, and that they essentially went after the locals who stood in the way of the mines or for whatever reason just engaged in random atrocities with no consideration for local communities. How was it that the government allowed them to attack civilians and others in the areas near mines?
So let me first of all give you a context as to why they're there in the first place, so that anyone who's listening can understand why they do what they do. Now, the Central African Republic descended into a civil war in 2013. And you had Muslim militias and Christian rebels fighting themselves to gain control of power. And because of the war, the conflict that was going on at the time, the United Nations Security Council imposed an arms embargo on the country. Well, the CARO was able to conduct an election in 2016, which ushered in the current president, Francine Archange Touadera. The problem President Touadera had at the time he took office was that only the capital, Bangui, was under the control of government forces. The rest of the country was either being controlled by, Muslim militiamen or Christian armed groups. So he didn't have a choice at the time but to seek help from somewhere. And so he went to Russia and asked Russia for assistance, first in getting the UN Security Council to lift the arms embargo. And then second, to have the Russians send military instructors to assist training local forces and also providing security for the president himself. But he didn't also stop that. He also sought ways of ensuring that the rebels who controlled, the rest of the country were pushed away from their strongholds. Now, Russia accepted to help, but they only accepted to do so in exchange for control of the gold mines, control of the gold and diamond resources. The problem was that the gold and diamond mines are not located in Bangui. They're in the rest of the country, scattered around, many places. And these mines, at the time the Russians decided to get involved, the mines were already in the control of rebels and militiamen. So when the Russians got to the Central African Republic, they saw firsthand the situation, and they knew that to take control of these gold and diamond mines, they needed to fight their way to gain control. And they started to do so with brutality. So they go to a particular mining community, and in an attempt to take control of the mine, they kill, they torture anyone who comes in their way. So that's what we have been seeing in the Central African Republic since 2018. Russian attempts to take control of the gold mines across the country, is usually bloody because the people who control these mines, armed men, will come from various, armed groups, rebels and militias and what have you. So that's why we see that very dangerous, very precarious situation in the CARO.
So what happened with those armed groups and militias? Was that situation ever resolved? Was there any sort of reintegration process or reconciliation process or anything else to kind of bring the remnants of the civil war to a close?
Well, the government made an offer to some of these rebels, asking that if they lay down their arms, there was a promise to get them into the armed forces and also to get them, work with the Russians, with the Wagner group. And that's why a couple of years ago in 2022, we began to see the recruitment of some former rebels into the Wagner group. And these local recruits were nicknamed the Black Russians. So they were promised training in Moscow, were promised, an incentive, some sort of an allowance every month if they were willing to lay down their arms and then join, either with the Russians or the armed forces. Usually in the Central African Republic, you can hardly make a distinction between the Russian paramilitaries and the armed forces because they all work hand in hand. And oftentimes we see a situation where the military in the Central African Republic take instructions from the Russians. You already have a Russian as the national security advisor to the president. So you have cabinet members seeking clearance from Russian officials before even gaining audience with the president. So the Russians really control so much of what's going on, in the country, particularly when it comes to security, and also when it comes to the media, because you have a Russian who's acting as if he's the communications advisor to the president. So yes, but in many ways, the reintegration program has, not been the way that people expect it to be, because some of the former rebels will, had to lay down their arms, couldn't find work, or those ones who were lucky to be embedded into the armed forces or into the Wagner group really are not getting the allowances that were promised. So it's in a total mess, if you ask me.
So once they started discovering that they were not getting everything they promised out of this arrangement, did they turn on the Russians and leave, or to continue their previous activity, or are they just putting up with it?
Well, some of them left the country completely. I remember speaking to a couple of former Black Russians, as these local recruits have been nicknamed. I met a couple of them in Cameroon 2 years ago, and that was where I got to even learn about how they got involved in the first place, how they were offered monthly allowances and even training in Moscow. And after a couple of months, they were not paid. Some of them were even sent to Moscow for training and never returned. And they became worried about, their safety and whereabouts. So the ones I met actually left the group completely and then fled to Cameroon. But I'm told, but I have not been able to confirm this, that some of them went back to join the rebels. Yeah, but I haven't spoken to anyone who left Wagner or the Central African Armed Forces to team up with the rebels. But I am told by some of my contacts that was what happened, but that's what has happened. But I also am aware that there's still efforts by the government to, reintegrate some former rebels. And the appeal to those who are still fighting with the rebels to lay down their arms and get involved and embrace the reintegration program is still there. Only problem is they don't really have a well-defined structure or a working structure that will keep these former rebels out of the militia life and then have them integrate completely into maybe the armed forces or the Wagner group or what have you. So that's the situation right now.
So my understanding is the African Union or various international organizations like the UN have not been particularly helpful in addressing the initial problem of the divisions between all these rebels and the struggles between the Muslim and Christian groups. None of that was actually resolved with the international assistance, and it was only the Russian involvement that in some way moderated the situation.
Well, some people in Bangui will tell you that they feel safer with the Russians being present. And I'm never going to doubt that, because in some ways, the Russians were able to provide the security that Bangui needed to keep itself safe from these rebels and militiamen. And in some areas outside Bangui, the Russian presence also was able to keep the rebels and militiamen at bay. But all these actions have come at a cost. Human rights abuses that continues to increase. But then you're right that the African Union and the United Nations really didn't achieve much in terms of bringing peace to the Central African Republic. As we speak, there are still United Nations missions, troops, which they call MINUSCA, that's active in the Central African Republic. You have personnel from various countries under the UN working in the Central African Republic to try to bring peace. But they're trying to avoid a clash with the Russians. Because I have spoken to many UN peacekeeping personnel, and they tell me, well, some of the problems they face is that they cannot do so much because the Russians are involved, and they don't want the confrontation with these very, very tough Russian paramilitaries. But in the past, we also had UN peacekeepers being accused of rape and also other sorts of abuse. Yeah, may not be at the scale at which the Russians have, but locals didn't trust that these peacekeepers, would be able to do so much to prevent rebels and other militia groups from, expanding their operations. So it's a matter of trust. And just like we've seen in Mali and in parts of the Sahel in Africa, where many local communities, many people are asking for assistance from Russia as against France. Because for many years, when there's been involvement of France, for example, when there's been involvement of UN peacekeepers in these countries, terror has continued to rise. And there's not been too much of results, or there hasn't really been results in terms of what these countries, including the Central African Republic, have benefited from with the presence of UN peacekeepers. So that's why, the trust for the West and the United Nations has really been dwindled.
So, seeing all of that, how did you end up encountering some of these people directly?
So, if I understand you, you're asking me how I encountered
these Wagner linked groups directly. How did you end up being grabbed by them?
Okay, well, before now, I have been reporting from Cameroon or from Nigeria, where I live. Remember, in 2022, most of my reporting on the Wagner group was done from Cameroon. So I go to Cameroon and then I look for people who have fled from the Central African Republic and are taking refuge in Cameroon. And that's how I was able to speak with many victims of Russian abuses, or let's say abuses by the Wagner group. And that's how I was even able to meet with a number of former rebels who later worked with the Wagner group. But last year, I decided to go into the country on my own. And I had to travel by road. I got a car that took me from Nigeria to Cameroon. And from Cameroon, I got another vehicle that transported me across, the northwest border between Cameroon and the Central African Republic. Now, there's a reason why I didn't fly to Bangui. In 2022, when I met two former Black Russians, two former members of the Wagner group who were recruited from the local rebel groups, they told me in Cameroon, where I met them, that they had been instructed by their Russian commanders that whenever they find me in the country, they should either arrest me or get me killed. So this is what I was told in 2022. So I resolved then that I was never going to fly into the Central African Republic or through Bangui. I was never going to fly into Bangui, the capital, because since they had told me that I was on their watch list, then that was too risky, too dangerous to do so. So that's why I had to go by road and into the northwest of the country. So in one of those days I got there, a day after I got there, I went to the border to interview, the border with Cameroon, to interview some people, including artisanal miners who had fled, who were fleeing the Central African Republic into Cameroon. So my contacts had told me that in the border, or at the border, I will be able to find people who are fleeing the conflict in the northwest and seeking to get into Cameroon. So once I got to the border, I was trying to get my equipment from my bag. That's my camera and my phone, to begin to interview these people, the people I met there, when 4 Central African soldiers showed up from nowhere. They drove in a pickup vehicle, and then they held me and began to drag me, trying to force me to go move along with them. And then I began to scream. I was asking that, I was crying for help, and they didn't stop. They kept dragging me. And in front of them were two Russian paramilitaries who kept encouraging them to take me away, claiming that I was a criminal. And eventually, they took me to their military base. It's like a small military outpost, so to speak. And then I was detained there overnight, and I was tortured, beaten with whips and sticks, And I was lucky to leave the following morning because the motorcyclist who took me to the border saw when I was, arrested and manhandled. So the following day, she went to a most senior military official in the Central African military, spoke to him about my situation, and it was this senior military official who came to the outpost and then asked and ordered my release. So that was how I was able to get out of custody, of being in detention by the Central African and the Russians, the Central African soldiers and the Russians, yes. So if this motorcyclist had not called this senior military officer to intervene, I'm not sure I would have come out alive. Yeah. So that was the situation I faced last December in the Central African Republic. It was in a town called Beloko. Beloko is a border community. It's on the border with Cameroon. Yeah.
So essentially, these abuses by the Wagner troops are being facilitated by the government forces.
Well, every time the Wagner group, or every time, or most times when Russian paramilitaries go on an operation, they don't just go alone. They're always accompanied by local Central African soldiers. So you could have like 4 or 5 Russian paramilitaries, and then you have a dozen Central African soldiers. So usually the local soldiers act based on the instructions of the Russian paramilitaries. Yes, so you have just a handful of Russians, and then the vast majority of soldiers are from the Central African Armed Forces, who usually accompany the Russians to anywhere they go. Yeah.
Were you ever able to find out the names of those specific individuals who were responsible for your detention and torture?
I tried to follow up, but it was difficult. They had no name tags, and some of them were even maxed. So it was difficult to know who they were. And recently, I continued, to reach out to some contacts in that area. So what happens oftentimes is that most of the government usually rotates the personnel that they send to different areas. So you could have a particular group of soldiers just present for a couple of weeks or maybe a few months, and then they're taken away. So my understanding is that the people who tortured me may not even be in Beloko as we speak. Yeah.
This is absolutely unbelievable. And you also mentioned that, you have contacts who've also been either, detained, arrested, mistreated, and so forth. Could you tell us a little about these other people?
The people who have been detained by the Russians in the past, right?
Mm-hmm. The ones that you knew, you mentioned that in your on your social media and in your article, that you were not the only one who've had horrible experiences or were over.
So yes,
Mhm.
yeah, like I said, in December, there were just 4 people who arrested me at the border, and then took me, to the outpost where I was detained in a very tiny container, so to speak, in Beloko. And they were very dark people, dark looking, and a couple of them I think were even maxed. So and they told me on the day I was released, they told me that I was lucky to get out of the place alive. That oftentimes people who come there don't leave the outpost alive. So they even bragged to my face, and they had taken my camera and my phone from me. And when I was leaving, I asked for my equipment, my camera and my phone, and they told me that they couldn't find it anymore. So I left detention without my camera and without my phone. So I had to go back to Cameroon to buy new equipment and then return back to the Central African Republic to continue my work. But it's not just me, you know. There are many people who have faced similar experiences, especially women. Not far away from Beloko is a town called Boa, which is the major city in the northwest. And in Boa, there is a military outpost. There's a military base, yes, that is being used by both the Wagner group and local soldiers. And in this military base, I spoke to a number of victims, you know, who had been detained in this military base. And they spoke about being raped by the Russians. In fact, they spoke about being abducted from their compounds, or maybe some of these victims were either abducted from their compounds, or maybe rescued by the Russians from kidnappers, or perhaps, you know, taken from the streets, or maybe they were seen on the streets, walking on the streets, and then all of a sudden they were seized by the Russians and taken to this military base in Boa.
Oh, you
Raped, after which they were administered contraceptives by these Russian soldiers. So it's a heartbreaking tale, you know, to listen to young girls, some of them as young as 14, you know, talking about how they were raped, and then in that situation, they were even bleeding. And after which the Russians administered contraceptive shots on them just to be sure that they don't get pregnant. So it's one of the many stories I have heard from victims in the Central African Republic. I also heard from young girls, teenagers who spoke about being raped in their farms in Boa by Russian paramilitaries. I also did hear, you know, in December from young men who live or who used to live in Koki. Koki is a mining community in the northwest of the Central African Republic. They told me how the Russians stormed their community, you know, on a particular day and began to open fire, you know, at anyone they saw, simply because the Russians wanted to chase them away from the mines, you know, in the mine, rather, in this community. So I've heard a lot of stories, a lot of very, very heartbreaking stories of rape, of slaughter, of killing, of torture. And it's not ending, because every single day, these stories keep being told.
Is there any approximate number of the people who were killed or who were tortured or raped by the Wagners?
So in Koki, I was told by witnesses that about 50 people were killed in October last year, when in an incident that took a number of days, when the Russians, you know, and the Central African soldiers stormed Koki and began to open fire, you know, at people. So about 50 were raped. And then in Bois, I understand that over a dozen girls, you know, were victims of this rape, and then been administered with contraceptives. So that's what I heard about. That's the number I heard in Bois. But previously in 2022, there was also an incident that happened in two communities in the central part of the country, in Aigbado and Yanga. These are two mining communities. And there was a massacre in Aigbado sometime in January 2022, where the Russians stormed Aigbado. And similar to what they did in Koki, they opened fire at, you know, local community members just to scare them away and just to kill those who they thought were benefiting from the gold mine. So I was told that about 70 people were killed in that incident in January 2022. Yes. So those are some of the biggest incidents that has been recorded in the Central African Republic.
Has there been any sort of international process for examining these incidents?
Yes, in Egbado, for example, the UN, carried out an investigation on the incident, and it was established that there was a massacre in Egbado. Yeah, but we haven't heard anything about Koki. Ever since I reported about Koki, the government hasn't taken action in terms of looking into what happened. And you will hardly find a government investigating these incidents. So if you're going to find any investigation on these human rights abuses, it's what comes from the international community, maybe the UN or other bodies. But the UN was involved in terms of looking into what happened in Aigbado. But it's also very difficult sometimes allowing UN investigators gain access to some of these areas because, like I said earlier, the Russians control the security structure in the Central African Republic, and they make it very difficult for international observers or international investigators to do their work.
So essentially, there's a complete state of lawlessness right now that's, with no one really having any control over CR other than the Russians and these forces fighting it out with the militias and attacking anyone who is around. So what is happening? What is the status of the mines? How many of these mines right now are controlled by Russians versus assorted other parties?
Well, there are over 100 mines in the Central African Republic, and many of them are now under the control of the Russians. Well, the big mines, like the one in Dasima, near Bambari, that's the biggest mine in the country. In fact, it's the only industrialized mine in the Central African Republic. That one is being controlled by the Russians. And I can't say for sure how many smaller mines are under the control of the Russians, but there are still many being held by the rebels or militiamen. And as we go forward, I expect that there will be more stories about the Russian paramilitaries attacking mining communities just to seize new gold mines. So yes, I don't know for sure the exact number that has been controlled by the Russians versus when it's been controlled by the armed groups, but I know that a good number of mines, are in Russian hands. Yeah.
Who works in those mines, and what are those communities typically alike? Are they mostly Christian? Are they mostly Muslim? Is it mixed?
Oh yes, there are communities where you find mostly Christians, and where you find gold mines, but they're mostly Christians. But there are also communities where you find gold mines, but the people are mostly Muslims. Like you go to the northeastern part, it's a predominantly Muslim area, and you have people from the Fulani ethnic group that really inhabit in these areas, and there are still gold mines there, and these gold mines are still in the control of the locals. Some of them, not all of them. But the people who usually work in these gold mines are local artisanal miners, the people who live around there. Because usually you always find in every family somebody who's involved in mining. So if it's not the man, it will be his child, his son. So oftentimes it's men, the head of the family, who's also bringing his children to work in this gold mine. So they're the local people who really benefit from these mines in terms of, their upkeep, in terms of their daily livelihoods that they gain from local mining. So what the Russians do is, when they go to these communities, they have the belief that everyone or most people who work in these mines are connected to the rebels. And make no mistake, they may be right sometimes, because in some places, not all places, in some places you find a situation where the rebels control these mines, and then they recruit people who are either sympathetic to the rebels or even work closely with the rebels to work in these mines. That happens in maybe a few mining sites, not everywhere. In other places, you have legitimate artisanal miners who are not in any way connected to these rebels, but who are working there. But generally, these the mines, the people you have working there are mostly artisanal miners who really want to, mine gold and then, sell to merchants and what have you.
So what happens once the Russians take over a mine? Do the same people continue working for the mines, or do they import workers from somewhere else?
Oftentimes, they bring workers from elsewhere because they don't trust the local people around.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they only take, in fact, most times they take over these mines and then nothing happens in the mines. So they take control of these gold mines and then operations just cease because the Russians have not found ways at which they can run these mines. So they usually would just want to be sure that these rebels or these militia groups don't continue the activities because it is believed that the gold and the diamonds fund these rebel groups, and the Russians, in collaboration with the armed forces, are at war with the rebels. And again, you know that the Russian companies
Mm-hmm.
have begun to become present in the Central African Republic. So most times in these gold mines, the people who do business there, the people who control them are Russian companies from Russia, even though registered in the country, but they're mostly Russian
Mm-hmm.
companies. They're the ones who find ways of engaging new miners, and then mine this gold, process this gold, and then sell to merchants. So that's what we see oftentimes. Or usually, oftentimes what we also see is the fact that the Russians chase, the local artisanal miners who are there, and then somehow bring in miners from elsewhere who mine the gold and then find a way to process and then make sure that they are handed over to other Russians who serve as merchants. Yeah. So it works in various ways.
So who are the people that they bring in? Are they from other parts of the country, or are they from other African countries?
No, usually miners come from either locally or
Mm-hmm.
from neighboring countries.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example. In the northeastern area of the Central African Republic, an area you call Andaha region. If before now, the miners who work in the mines in that region are miners who have come from Sudan
Mm-hmm.
or from Chad. You also have the locals who are there. And these are miners who have been doing such work for many years, and they have left their countries to go work. But the thing about the Russians is, whenever they want to gold mine, they want to make sure that everyone who worked there before they came no longer works again. So there are situations where the Russians have come, seized gold mines, and then brought workers from within the country and also from Sudan. And don't forget that the Russians have been involved in the gold business in Sudan, right from when Omar al-Bashir was president. In fact, since 2019 or so, or thereabout, 2017 to 2018, the Russians have been involved in the gold business in the northern part of Sudan. And they really have made contacts, and made, with a number of miners in Sudan. So some of these miners from Sudan are also working in the mines in the Central African Republic. Yeah. So they find new miners from other parts of the Central African Republic. They also get miners from neighboring Sudan who they bring in to the Central African Republic to work in these gold mines.
Is there ever a clash between the disenfranchised local communities who lose their mines and these new miners that the Russians bring in? Are there any incidents?
Well, I haven't heard of any. Doesn't mean they don't exist. But oftentimes when the Russians are in a particular community, they are being secured by the local soldiers. So and most times when the Russians, seize these gold mines, what happens is that the local artisanal miners usually flee from these communities. Hardly find a situation where the miners remain because most of them are always scared for their safety because they think that if they stay back, and they could be killed,
Sure.
so to speak. So they usually leave these communities and go elsewhere. Yeah, so that avoids any clash between them and the new miners who are in town.
Where do they go with their families and how do they make their living afterwards?
They oftentimes go to find new mines where they can work as miners.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they do. They travel very far. Some people travel from east to west, and then to see where they can find new opportunities. Some eventually end up in displaced persons camps, or some those, especially those who live in the northwest, they flee to Cameroon and then find refuge in refugee camps and settlements. So those who have the courage to stay back, try to find new jobs in new mines. But those who are so afraid of their safety, end up across the border into neighboring countries. Yeah.
So it's fair to say that there's been a fair amount of displacement as a result of all of this.
Oh yes, oh yes. There's a huge displacement crisis in the Central African Republic. You have in a number of major towns, you have refugee camps, you have internally displaced persons camps, and then you have also, hundreds of thousands who have, fled to Cameroon, for example, living in camps, also to Chad, before now to Sudan many years ago. So yes, you have this displacement crisis, still a big problem in the Central African Republic.
So once the Russians acquire those mines, what happens to the gold and the diamonds? Are they used to pay the new miners? Are they transported outside of the country? And if so, how?
So usually you have merchants who buy this gold from the Russians. Or normally what happens before now is that when the miners mine, they sell to merchants who could be anyone. Could be merchants from the country, could be merchants from Sudan, from Chad, from Cameroon, from anywhere. But in many places, it is even in areas where the Russians don't control the gold mine, but they don't think that the miners who work there, work for the rebels. What the Russians do is they force these miners to sell the gold to them. So there are still some places in the country where the Russians have not taken over the gold mine. And it may be deliberate. Perhaps that they feel that they don't have the personnel, to work in the mines if they seize it. Or also they may feel that the people who work in these mines are not rebels or militiamen, so they leave them to work. But then they force these miners to sell all the gold they mine to the Russians. And once the Russians get this gold, they sell to other middlemen, maybe in Cameroon. I know of Cameroon because I have done an investigation in the past about how this gold is sold. So they sell to other middlemen in Cameroon who find ways of selling elsewhere, maybe in West Africa or there. But there are also allegations of this gold being sold in the Middle East. Remember in the case of Sudan, where some planes came from the Middle East and then had to load gold into their planes and then took back to the Middle East. So they have a market in the Middle East, and they still have middlemen in Africa, in West Africa, with a sell to, and then this middlemen also find, these middlemen eventually take the gold elsewhere, apparently still to the Middle East. Yes, but the black market for gold is huge here in Africa, but even more bigger in the Middle East. Yeah.
So what is the number of what would you say is the number of the Wagner troops, not the black Russians, but the actual Russians present inside the country right now?
Before the war in Ukraine, there were close to 2,000 paramilitaries. But when Russia began its war in Ukraine, some were pulled from the country and taken to the Donbas region of Ukraine to fight Russia's war on the country. And I don't know for sure how many there are right now. And I also know that some were still brought back. There were new recruits that came from Russia to replace some that had left. But it's not clear exactly how many are there, but some reports say there are about 1,000 1,200 or thereabout. But there's still a huge number of, I think they're in the hundreds, maybe up to 1,000 or so. Yeah, but there's still a huge number of Russians present in the country.
What has been the impact of that on the rebel activity? I mean, obviously they were able to dislodge some of them, but what about the rest? Has there been some sort of a pushback by the rebels against the government as a result of this of the Wagner entrance? Has there been more, rebellious activities in some areas as a result of
I think
dissatisfaction?
initially, I think initially the Russians had some gains initially. And what I see now is that the local population, particularly in the northeast and northwest regions, have been able to read, to understand the agenda of the Russians. And they know that the Russians are in this for economic gains. So you have a situation where people, local communities who have been deprived of their livelihoods because they've been chased from the gold mines. Some of them have even decided to support these rebels. So before now, up until 2000, the rebel groups were operating loosely. You have different groups, different armed groups operating on their own. But they all came together in 2000 just to be able to disrupt the elections that year, the presidential election. But what we've seen is since then, you only have maybe one or two groups who left their coalition, but you have pretty much almost all or most of the rebel groups under a single umbrella working against the Russians and the Central African forces. So I think they are still very formidable because you're still seeing situations where they're even attacking the Russians and then even killing a couple of Russian paramilitaries. So they're still very formidable, and they don't have the same bite they had many years ago, in the sense that the ability to seize new towns close to the capital, they don't have that ability anymore. But they still control some areas in the northeast and in the northwest, and they're still able to plan isolated attacks targeted at the Russians, yes. And it's not a war that will end anytime soon. I don't think it's going to end anytime soon because some people are still building anger. People are still angry, and that anger is building towards the Russians, yes.
So you've seen recently, we heard about the Ukrainian involvement in West Africa against the Wagner, and there was a clash, and they killed a whole group of them. Is there any presence of Ukrainian intelligence in Sierra in from what you've seen?
Well, if the Ukrainians are there, they're not visible. We haven't seen anything to suggest that the Ukrainians are working in the Sierra. And if they are working, they probably, if they have to get involved, it has to be working closely with the rebels because this is the country as a whole. The Russians have a big say in the way things are done in the country as far as the government angle is concerned. They're working very closely with the government. So I don't expect to see Ukraine get involved from the government angle. If they are involved at all, it will have to be with the rebels. But there's nothing so far to suggest that Ukraine is involved, in operations with the rebels and other armed groups in the Central African Republic. Yeah. And even in Mali, where we had that Ukraine claimed to give support to the rebels who attacked and killed dozens of Russian paramilitaries many weeks back. We don't know for sure how much involvement Ukraine was in that, and how much Ukraine works very closely with the rebels in Mali. So it's still not clear exactly what Ukraine does, if at all it does anything tangible in Western Central Africa.
Has there been, you mentioned the trolling campaigns against France and all of that. Has there been any effort by any outside country to sort of provide an alternative solution or get the government to stop working with the Wagner and provide any sort of alternative security assistance or any alternative mechanism for governance, because it seems to me a kind of hopeless scenario where there's absolute disorder, and you have the rebels, and you have the Russian forces, and you don't actually have a infrastructure for effective governance at all.
Publicly, I haven't heard anything of in such, and I think that many nations have been very careful working with governments that are allied to Russia, because you don't usually get the truth in terms of cooperation with Russia, and you get in the situation where at the end of the day, you're in no man's land. So I know that, like in the CAR, for example, Bancroft, an American company, sought to get involved in the country in terms of offering training and military assistance for the government. But the Russians were pretty much against that arrangement. And what we saw in the aftermath of, Bancroft's decision to offer assistance was that the Russians started to sponsor many outlets across Western Central Africa to spread disinformation against the Americans, targeting American interests generally in the Central African Republic. So it was very difficult, and as we speak, Bancroft has not been able to gain access, into the country in terms of operating in the country. So it's very, very difficult, and people on the nation, many countries understand the precarious nature of the Central African Republic. And it's even worse in countries like Mali and the rest, where not only are the Russians active there, you have an illegitimate government, so to speak, because these are military governments in place in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, countries where normally the international community would have loved to get involved. But you have a military, dictatorship in these countries that really are not receptive to countries that are willing or that will be willing to support, particularly Western countries. So they have more or less blocked or cut all ties with Western nations. And even with the regional body in West Africa, for example, ECOWAS, which is the regional body, these countries have cut ties. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they've cut ties with ECOWAS. So that makes it very difficult for the international community to get involved here.
So it's funny, you mentioned that at best there's a few thousand of Wagner troops, and likely less because some of them were moved out into Ukraine. But nevertheless, it seems like the ones that are there have a pretty strong hold, enough that they cannot be easily removed by force by anybody. What is it that makes them so well, entrenched?
Well, I think the incentive that they get, the motivation for gold, gold and diamond, and some of them have been there for many years. So they understand what they're in, and they act with impunity, and nobody holds them to account for the abuses they commit. So they live like kings or like lords in the country. And I don't know of anyone who will live in such kind of environment where you act with impunity, you do what you want to do, and you're not accountable for your actions. And I can think of, you hardly will find anyone who will be in that situation and not be happy about it. So yes, it's the fact that they're able to do whatever they want to do and get away with it, and the fact that they can get involved in illicit trade in gold and diamond resources, and then make more money, much more than they would have imagined. That makes them very formidable, so to speak. And this is also a country that is very corrupt. And you see politicians and people in kickbacks and get involved in all sorts of illicit activities. So this kind of activities have given a lot of strength, to the Russians.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
Oh, no, that wasn't me. I heard you. So we are seeing a sort of a new colonialism by the Russians. They're literally pillaging resources in exchange for, government cooperation. Is there, other than the security, has there been any positive return to any of the communities? Have they invested into any sort of local support, or has there been any investment as a result of their presence?
Yes, there's some things that the Russians do to really, get the local community involved.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's been a movie production in the country where some locals got involved in, and even business-wise, there's been a Russian beer also that sells, and then people are recruited to assist in terms of this sale. And there've been other local programs, dance, educational programs and dance programs that the
Mm-hmm.
Russians really, brought. But these programs are mostly in Bangui, as in the, and we don't get to see much of this elsewhere. So yes, in that light, there's some little programs that the Russians have brought in that some people are happy about. Some people, I mean, not everyone. Yeah.
Well, this is a very bleak scenario overall, unfortunately, and I am so glad that you're speaking out about that and giving this information because, well, of course, there's been reports about these in things going on. None of them have been very precise or detailed, and none of them give this, picture or this complex picture of the security scenario and human rights scenario. And of course, hearing personal accounts of people who've been affected by it directly is also a huge difference from the general reporting. And thank you so much for continuing this difficult work. I'm sorry about your experiences, and I hope you'll find a way to bring them to justice at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Irina. And I hope that what we do, some of us do, will eventually have great results. Yeah, I hope so too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. Those watching the program, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, will be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. And thank you for sticking with us. Have a great evening.
Thank you.